Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the world stands at the crossroads of shock and consequence. Haifa is burning not just in the physical sense of a missile strike, but in the fiery symbolism of what this event means for global politics, economics, and the fragile illusion of stability that we've built around modern geopolitics. Yemen's Falaq missile, in a single flash of light, has shattered that illusion, and the reverberations are being felt in every capital, every boardroom, and every stock exchange across the globe. The world awoke to an unsettling dawn when the news broke. Haifa in flames. In an instant, a single missile, Yemen's Falaq, transformed the global stage. What had long been considered a distant conflict confined to the peripheries of the Middle East suddenly erupted into the consciousness of every major capital. The Haifa strike was more than an act of war. It was a geopolitical earthquake, a moment that exposed the vulnerabilities of nations that once believed themselves untouchable. The images of burning docks, blackened skies, and chaotic evacuation scenes did not just dominate news feeds, they symbolized a dramatic shift in power perception and the crumbling myth of regional security. The Falaq missile strike sent a message heard far beyond Haifa's borders. It was a signal that the global order, built on asymmetrical power and long-standing military dominance, is no longer as stable as it seemed. For decades, conflicts in Yemen were treated as peripheral tragedies, stories that flickered briefly across international headlines before being replaced by the next global distraction. But this time, Yemen was not the victim of the story. It became the author. The oppressed had found a way to strike back, and in doing so, they disrupted the comfortable hierarchy of international relations. The shock did not stem solely from the physical destruction, but from the symbolism that a nation ravaged by war, famine, and blockade could still project such strategic capability. It was a defiance of expectation, a rewriting of geopolitical logic. Markets trembled within hours, oil prices surged, the shipping industry braced for disruption in the Red Sea, and insurance premiums for regional trade skyrocketed. Global investors who had comfortably dismissed Yemen as a non-factor in the international economy suddenly found themselves reevaluating risk models. The interconnectedness of today's world became painfully clear. A missile launch from a war-torn nation could ripple through Wall Street and the London Stock Exchange within minutes. The Haifa strike was no longer a local conflict. It was an economic event with planetary consequences. The political narrative that followed was equally revealing. Western powers rushed to condemn the strike, using the familiar rhetoric of aggression and destabilization. Yet behind the public outrage lay a quiet anxiety. If Yemen could do this, who else might be capable of challenging the established order? The event exposed the fragility of deterrence and the limits of military superiority. Nations long accustomed to acting without consequence were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that the monopoly on advanced weaponry no longer guarantees safety. The psychological balance of power had shifted, perhaps irreversibly. For the global public, the Haifa strike was a wake-up call, a reminder that the world is far more volatile than leaders often admit. It shattered the illusion of distance, the comforting notion that wars over there could never spill over here. Every explosion, every plume of smoke seemed to echo a deeper truth. The age of unilateral power is waning, and the echoes of rebellion are growing louder. The missile's trail, etched across the night sky, was more than a weapon's path. It was a declaration that even the smallest nation, when pushed to the edge, can set the world trembling. For years, Yemen was spoken of only in the language of pity and crisis, a nation synonymous with famine, war, and humanitarian catastrophe. It was the backdrop of other powers' ambitions, a chessboard on which stronger players made their moves. Yet, in one shocking moment, that narrative was rewritten. Yemen, the so-called pawn of the Middle East, has transformed into a player, a nation capable of shaping events rather than merely suffering them. The launch of the Falaq missile that struck Haifa was not just a show of military defiance, it was a declaration that Yemen would no longer remain a silent spectator in its own tragedy. The moment the missile left its launcher, the global perception of Yemen shifted from a nation at the mercy of others to one that could command attention on its own terms. What makes this transformation so striking is its context. For nearly a decade, Yemen has endured relentless airstrikes, economic blockades, and international isolation. Its infrastructure has been devastated, its people pushed to the brink of survival. Yet beneath that suffering, something remarkable was taking shape: resilience, innovation, and a collective determination to resist. The development and deployment of the Falaq missile are proof that Yemen's people, even under siege, have found ways to build, strategize, and respond. It is not merely a military achievement, it is a political and psychological evolution. The oppressed have learned the language of deterrence, and they are speaking it fluently. When a nation once dismissed as powerless demonstrates such strategic capability, it forces the world to reassess everything it thought it knew about power itself. This is the shock that reverberated after Haifa burned. Yemen's action revealed the limits of military superiority and exposed the fragility of systems built on domination. The message is unmistakable. A nation's worth is not measured solely by its wealth or weaponry, but by its will. And in that regard, Yemen has become a symbol of defiant endurance, a nation that refuses to disappear quietly. Every missile launched, every defense mounted, carries with it the unspoken cry of a people who have been underestimated for far too long. This transformation also carries deep political significance. It challenges the global narrative that small nations are merely pawns in the games of empires. Yemen's emergence as an active player is a direct rebuke to decades of foreign intervention that treated its sovereignty as expendable. By striking at Haifa, Yemen forced powerful nations to reckon with a new reality. The age of unchallenged dominance is fading. The very idea that a war-torn country could deliver a strategic, high-impact strike against a regional powerhouse disrupts the traditional hierarchies of global power. It is a moment that compels policymakers and analysts alike to confront an uncomfortable truth. When you push the marginalized to the edge, they eventually push back. There is also a moral and symbolic layer to this transformation. For millions across the global south, Yemen's defiance has become a story of redemption, proof that dignity and resistance can survive even under the weight of immense oppression. It serves as a reminder that power is not only held by the rich or the technologically advanced, it is also born from conviction, endurance, and necessity. The Falaq missile was more than a weapon. It was a message written in fire that Yemen will no longer be a footnote in someone else's history. It will, from this moment forward, be an author of its own destiny, however perilous that may be. The detonation over Haifa did not just ignite flames in the port city, it sent shockwaves through the arteries of global finance. Within minutes of the Falaq missile's impact, markets began to convulse. Oil futures spiked, shipping insurers froze new contracts, and energy traders scrambled to assess what had just happened. A strike launched from war-torn Yemen had, in a single moment, shaken the entire economic framework that connects the Middle East to the world's financial capitals. It was as if the global economy had suddenly realized how fragile its stability truly was, how one spark in a distant region could ignite panic in the towers of New York, London, and Tokyo. This event was not merely about geopolitics, it was about economics, raw, interconnected, and brutally exposed. The Red Sea, already one of the world's most vital maritime routes, became a zone of fear. Ship captains rerouted through longer, costlier paths to avoid potential strikes, pushing freight costs upward. Energy markets, ever the barometer of global anxiety, reacted instantly. Brent crude leapt to new highs, while analysts warned that continued regional escalation could cripple supply chains dependent on Gulf exports. For consumers, this translated to more expensive fuel, higher transport costs, and ripple effects that could squeeze economies already strained by inflation. The missile did not just hit Haifa, it struck at the illusion of economic predictability. Investors, who often view war as an abstract variable, suddenly faced tangible consequences. Global stock markets turned volatile as uncertainty spread. Defense companies saw their shares soar, while airlines, logistics firms, and import-dependent industries faced immediate downturns. The financial world thrives on confidence, and Yemen's unexpected show of force shattered it. Economists have long described the global market as a web, intricately connected, resilient in appearance, but vulnerable to sudden shocks. The Haifa strike revealed just how thin that web truly is. In the blink of an eye, a single missile had managed to do what entire policy shifts could not: expose the deep interdependence and fragility of the global capitalist system. Beyond the immediate numbers, there was a more profound realization unfolding in boardrooms and ministries worldwide. The event demonstrated that geopolitical instability is no longer confined by borders or regional interests. It is now a global economic variable, one that can no longer be ignored or controlled by conventional diplomacy. Yemen's action, viewed through an economic lens, was not simply a military maneuver, but an assertion of influence. It proved that even nations excluded from the global market system could disrupt it when pushed too far. This redefinition of leverage is what truly unsettled the global elite, the understanding that control over economic stability is no longer the privilege of a few powerful states. What made this shock especially powerful was its timing. In a world already grappling with inflation, energy shortages, and financial uncertainty, the strike was like a stone thrown into an already trembling pond. Each ripple amplified the others, spreading anxiety faster than any missile could travel. Suddenly, the world's most powerful economies found themselves reacting to the decisions of a nation they had long dismissed as inconsequential. It was a harsh reminder that in a deeply interconnected global economy, no country is too small to matter, and no conflict is too distant to disrupt the balance. The economic reverberations of the Haifa strike continue to underscore one unsettling truth. In our modern world, power is no longer defined solely by wealth or weaponry, but by the ability to unsettle the systems others depend upon. The aftermath of the Haifa strike unveiled a pattern all too familiar in modern geopolitics: the swift chorus of condemnation from Western capitals cloaked in moral outrage. Politicians and commentators flooded the airwaves, describing Yemen's action as an unprovoked act of aggression, a violation of international law, and a threat to regional stability. Yet behind the rhetoric lies an uncomfortable question that few dared to confront. How can those who have spent decades waging wars, funding interventions, and enforcing blockades suddenly claim the moral high ground? The irony was not lost on observers who have long noted the selective morality of the powerful. When the oppressed strike back, it is labeled terrorism. When the powerful do the same, it is called defense. This double standard did not just expose hypocrisy, it laid bare the moral contradictions that define the modern world order. Western governments, who for years supplied weapons that rained destruction upon Yemen, were now expressing shock at a retaliatory strike. The same nations that justified bombings in Sana'a under the pretext of security found it intolerable when Haifa became a target. The reaction revealed an unsettling truth. In the eyes of the global elite, violence is permissible only when it flows downward, from the powerful to the powerless. Once the direction reverses, the language of morality abruptly changes. What was once collateral damage becomes a humanitarian tragedy. What was once strategic defense becomes unacceptable aggression. This selective compassion is not accidental. It is the ideological glue that sustains global dominance. The media, as always, played its part in amplifying this narrative. Western outlets quickly framed the story around Israel's victimhood, downplaying the years of siege, famine, and bombardment that Yemen has endured. There was little mention of the thousands of Yemeni civilians killed in airstrikes supported by Western arms deals. The context was erased, replaced by a neatly packaged story designed to maintain moral clarity for Western audiences. It is a manipulation so subtle yet so effective, one that transforms complex realities into black and white tales of good and evil. By controlling the moral narrative, the West preserves its image as the world's arbiter of justice, even when its actions defy that very principle. What makes this hypocrisy especially striking is its predictability. Each time the balance of power is challenged, moral language becomes a weapon of control. It is used not to guide justice, but to preserve hierarchy. The condemnation of Yemen's missile strike was not about humanitarian concern, it was about fear that the long ignored and marginalized might begin to assert their own agency. When Yemen's Falaq missile reached Haifa, it did more than pierce the sky. It pierced the illusion that the West's moral authority remains unchallenged. It forced the world to confront a difficult truth, that morality in the hands of empires is often nothing more than a mask worn to justify convenience. Across the global South, this hypocrisy did not go unnoticed. For millions who have lived under sanctions, occupations, or foreign-backed wars, the Western response to Yemen's action was another reminder of a world order built on double standards. The outrage over Haifa rang hollow against the silence that followed years of suffering in Sana'a, Gaza, and Tripoli. The moral outcry was not about justice. It was about control. Yemen's defiance shattered that illusion, revealing a deeper reckoning that can no longer be silenced. The world is watching, and the old moral hierarchies are beginning to collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The strike on Haifa did more than ignite a city. It symbolized the slow but undeniable erosion of Western dominance in global affairs. For decades, Western powers have dictated the rhythm of world politics, setting the rules, defining the moral codes, and enforcing economic hierarchies that benefited a select few. Yet, in the wake of Yemen's Falaq missile, a different story began to unfold, one where the once marginalized nations of the global South are no longer content to remain silent spectators. The very idea that a nation like Yemen, battered by years of war and economic blockade, could project power in a way that unsettled global markets and military analysts alike speaks to a profound shift in the balance of influence. The illusion of unassailable Western supremacy is cracking, and through those fractures, a multipolar world is emerging. This erosion did not happen overnight. It has been building slowly, decade after decade, as Western interventions left behind failed states, economic dependency, and growing resentment. The same global system that once ensured compliance through military strength and financial leverage is now facing rebellion from unexpected corners. Yemen's strike was not merely an isolated act of defiance, it was part of a broader trend, from the assertive diplomacy of BRICS nations to the strategic realignments in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Countries that once bowed to Western dictates are now forging alliances based on mutual interest rather than subservience. The symbolic power of Yemen's action lies in its message. The age of Western monopoly over global decision-making is nearing its end. In Washington, London, and Brussels, policymakers were quick to downplay the significance of the Haifa incident, framing it as an isolated provocation rather than a symptom of systemic change. But beneath their reassurances lies unease. Every successful challenge to Western dominance, no matter how small, chips away at the psychological foundation of global hierarchy. The West's authority once rested not just on military or economic might, but on the perception of inevitability, the belief that its dominance was natural, eternal, and unshakable. The Falaq missile shattered that illusion. It showed that even the poorest nations, when pushed to desperation, can disrupt the system that claims to control them. The erosion of dominance is not only geopolitical but ideological. The narrative of Western moral superiority, that its interventions bring democracy, its sanctions deliver justice, and its wars ensure peace, no longer convinces the world as it once did. The people of the global South have witnessed too many liberations that ended in ruins, too many promises of reform that brought only dependency. Yemen's defiance, therefore, resonates beyond the battlefield. It is a rejection of the old narrative that equates power with virtue. The fact that a besieged nation could command global attention not through wealth or diplomacy, but through raw assertion, signals a turning point in international relations. What makes this moment so powerful is not just the strike itself, but what it represents, a shifting tide in global consciousness. The Haifa attack has become a metaphor for a world waking up from its post-Cold War slumber, realizing that the West no longer holds exclusive ownership of strength, innovation, or legitimacy. The rise of independent powers, the diversification of global trade, and the digital democratization of information have all weakened the grip of traditional empires. As Western influence wanes, new centers of power are rising, not always aligned, but united in their desire for sovereignty. The world that emerges from this transition may be turbulent, uncertain, and uneven, but one truth has become undeniable. The monopoly of the West over the fate of nations is fading, and the voices once silenced at the margins are beginning to define the future. The flames that engulfed Haifa were more than a scene of destruction. They were a mirror held up to the world, reflecting decades of injustice, exploitation, and silence. The strike served as a visceral reminder that the structures we have built to sustain order are, in truth, built upon imbalance and hypocrisy. It was not just a missile that crossed the sky, but a message that humanity can no longer continue along a path defined by domination and indifference. A global reckoning is no longer a moral luxury. It has become a necessity. The world stands on the edge of a transformation, one that demands we confront the consequences of power, greed, and complacency before the next act of defiance burns brighter than this one. Every nation, every leader, and every institution must now face the uncomfortable truth that the current global system is unsustainable. The gap between the powerful and the powerless has widened into an abyss. For decades, policies have been written to serve the interests of the few, while the majority struggle under economic hardship, foreign intervention, and social decay. The Haifa strike, in this light, was not an isolated act of aggression, but the symptom of a deeper disease, one that festers in every society that values profit over people. The cries from Yemen, long ignored by global powers, have now turned into an explosion heard around the world. The message is clear: the oppressed will not remain voiceless forever. This moment calls for a fundamental reevaluation of how the world defines justice and peace. The Western-led order, with its endless wars packaged as humanitarian missions and its sanctions disguised as diplomacy, has reached its moral and political limits. True reform will not come from new alliances or treaties, but from a change in values, from competition to cooperation, from exploitation to equity. If the 20th century was defined by empire and resistance, the 21st must be defined by accountability and reform. It is no longer enough to condemn violence while fueling it through economic and political manipulation. The time has come for nations to look beyond borders, to understand that global security cannot exist in a world where some live in abundance while others starve in silence. The Haifa incident has forced even the most complacent observers to recognize that the costs of inaction are rising. Every crisis ignored, every injustice rationalized, brings the world closer to another explosion, not just of weapons, but of social unrest, economic collapse, and political instability. If humanity continues to prioritize dominance over dialogue, it will inherit a future defined by fear rather than progress. This reckoning, therefore, is not a threat but an opportunity, a chance to rewrite the story before it reaches its breaking point. The fire that burned in Haifa illuminated more than the destruction of a port. It revealed the fragility of the world we've built. It showed that peace without justice is an illusion, and stability without fairness is temporary. The call for global reform is no longer a voice from the margins. It is the echo of conscience rising from every corner of the earth. The world must decide whether to continue down the path of division and denial, or to finally embrace a new era of shared humanity, where power is tempered by responsibility and justice is more than a word used to justify violence.